Hi, let's learn about the American with Disabilities Act as a part of fair housing. The Americans with Disabilities Act, an overview. The American with Disabilities Act, known as ADA, is a wide-ranging civil rights law that it is intended to protect against discrimination based on disability. It was passed in 1990. The definition of disability was broadened by amendments to ADA, which were passed later in 2008. Through the Act, the law now defines a person with disability as any person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Private and public, reasonable accommodations. A provision within the American with Disabilities Act requires that accommodations be made when reasonable, when they are necessary to suit the needs of the person with the disability. This could result in changes in rules or policies, such as how rent is collected or the mechanism used to receive an application. A reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, adaptation, or modification to a policy, program, or service that allows a person with a disability to use and enjoy a dwelling. Owners and landlords may need to make reasonable accommodations if the accommodation is necessary to ensure that a person with a disability has equal opportunity to use and enjoy the dwelling or space. Examples of reasonable accommodations: allowing a person with a disability to mail the rent instead of delivering it in person to the office, or assigning a parking space closest to the exit or the unit to tenants with mobility disabilities, or allowing persons with disabilities to keep service or quality of life animals despite a general no pets policy. Or not counting a home health aide, therapist, nurse, etc. as an additional tenant or guest, or allowing a tenant to move to a more suitable unit when one becomes available, or releasing a tenant with disabilities who must move because of his or her disability from lease requirements. Reasonable modifications. Another provision provides that reasonable modifications must be allowed to alter housing to suit a person with a disability. This requirement applies to private as well as public housing. All modifications are to be made at the resident's expense, unless voluntarily accepted by a landlord. Examples include installing an entrance ramp, repositioning outlets and switches, lowering the entry threshold, or installing grab bars in a bathroom. A reasonable modification is a physical change made to a tenant or owner's living space or to a common area that is necessary to ensure that the tenant or owner who has a disability has full enjoyment of the dwelling or space. Modifications are usually made at the tenant's or the owner's expense, except in the case of federally funded housing. Owners and landlords must allow for reasonable modification of a living space of a person with a disability if the modification is necessary to ensure full enjoyment. Examples of reasonable modifications: building ramps over steps to allow wheelchair access, installing lever door openers instead of door knobs, widening door openings by installing swing-away hinges or wider pocket doors, installing grab bars and handrails. Installing wheelchair accessible shower stalls, changing tub faucets to an offset location, removing under the sink cupboards in bathrooms, lowering light switches. New construction and renovation of public accommodations and commercial facilities. The goal under ADA is for individuals with disabilities to have fair and equal access to buildings. This includes the implementation of wider doors and ramps for wheelchairs, as an example. Multifamily housing. Under ADA, covered multifamily housing built and ready for occupancy after March 13, 1991, must follow design requirements to ensure that housing is accessible to persons with disabilities. Covered housing applies to most public and private housing. Owner-occupied buildings with no more than 4 units, single-family housing sold or rented without the use of a broker, and housing operated by organizations and private clubs that limit occupancy to members are exempt from this provision. These requirements apply to multifamily housing consisting of 4 or more units with an elevator. 1. Accessible entrance on an accessible route. 2. Accessible public and common use areas. 3. Usable doors. 4. Accessible route into and through the dwelling unit. 5. Accessible light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and environmental controls. 6. Reinforced walls and bathrooms. 7. Usable kitchens and bathrooms. For multifamily housing consisting of 4 or more units without an elevator, all ground floor units must comply with the 7 design requirements noted above. Access to public transportation, public accommodation, and commercial facilities. The American with Disabilities Act is broader than housing issues. It also addresses and attempts to create access to public transportation, public accommodation, and commercial facilities. Title I of ADA applies specifically to employment, including real estate brokerages. It requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations for applicants and employees with disabilities and prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in all aspects of employment.